front to back, side to side, back to night. I should have prepared. Before we get to the slides themselves, I'd like to give you a brief resume of the story of Abbie Gardner and the Spirit Lake Massacre. Most of you have a pretty good idea of it. But to start out, I'm going to read for you Abbie's own words. Now, when Inkpaduta and his band of Indians showed up in the evening of March 8, 1857, the first thing that happened is that they asked Abbie's father, Roland, if he would share some flour. And he went to their flour bin, which Abbie describes as very scanty. They had used most of it through the very severe winter. And as he bent over to the flour bin, one of the Indians shot him, and he fell to the floor, dead. Remember, this was when Abbie was a 13-year-old girl. Next, what happened is that her sister Mary, who was living in the cabin with them, with their husband Harvey Luce, her sister Mary, who was 19, and Abbie's mom, Frances, tried to get the gun away from the Indian. By the way, in 1935, when this was presented, I'm sure that they would have referred to the Native Americans or the indigenous people as Indians. Since we are now traveling back to that era, that's I shall refer to them. At that point, the Indians took Mary and Frances and beat them to death with the stocks of their gun. Now, Abbie is sitting there, obviously horrified. And here is what happens. When the Indians entered the house, and during these awful scenes, I was seated in a chair, holding my sister's baby in my arms, Amanda. My little brother, Amanda, by the way, was 4 years old. My little brother, Roland Gardner Jr., who was 6 on the other side. And here is something pretty significant. My sister's son, Albert, who was sitting next to me. The children were clinging to me in terror, begging me for protection that I could not give. The Indians next seized the children, dragged them outside of the cabin, and beat them to death with logs of stove wood. And that was just the beginning for Abbie. At that point in time, the Indians went to the other cabins. There were 5 additional cabins. By the way, the Gardners were the very first settlers to establish a homestead in this area. Fairly soon after they were here, the other pioneers came and also built log cabins. In all, during the next 2 or 3 days, the Indians killed 38 of the pioneers. Now, a lot of this story you really can't make up. You couldn't make up. It almost sounds stranger than fiction. During this time, there was a person by the name of Morris Markham, and he was a guest, as I understand it, at the Thatcher cabin, which was located on the lake about where Arthur Heights is today. He had lost a couple of oxen that had wandered off into the prairie. That, at the time, was big blue stem, 6 to 7 feet tall, and he searched for them. That was on the morning of March 8th, before the massacre. He spent about 2 or 3 days searching for the oxen, finally found them. He was quite tired. He was to the south of the area, didn't think he could want to make it back to the cabin, quite a ways north. So he was going to stop at the Gardner cabin. And what he saw was the slaughter there. Can you imagine the surreal condition of his mind? He, at that point, went to the Maddock cabin, which was located about where, at the isthmus on the south side of the bridge, between east and west. And he saw the same thing. Now, this person had a great, I think, deal of bravery, because instead of running as fast as he could to get safety, he warned the people. There was a little settlement up at Jackson, Minnesota, then called Springfield, and he warned them of the possibility of an Indian attack. And had he not warned them, there might have been many killed there also. And so that's sort of what the basic background. So let's travel back now to 1935. We'll put ourselves in the place of people listening to and watching Abbie Gardner's grandson, and let's see what they saw. So this is Abbie Gardner's grandson, Albert Gardner II. It must have been an emotional moment, don't you think, for Abbie Gardner when she had her firstborn son, to give him the name Albert in recognition of that little 4-year-old boy that was torn from her hands. And so Albert, I think, had a great deal of significance to Abbie, Abbie Gardner. Don't you think you can see strength there? I think if you look in that face, you can see the perseverance that she had to have. And as we work our way through this presentation, you'll see that she needed every bit of courage that she could muster. All right. This is a picture of early Spirit Lake. That picture is about 1879. And if you take a look at this, back there in the left-hand side is the New York store. La-dee-da. But at any rate, they thought that might indicate that you can buy some really cool stuff there. Over here is the Minnewacan Hotel. Interesting that one of the very first large structures in the city of Spirit Lake were for visitors, or was for visitors. Here is a flour mill, and that again was one of the earlier structures. By the way, I just read an account that I had not heard of before, that early on, probably even maybe a little before this, in the settlement, there was a high water episode, and someone actually built a small flour mill on the isthmus between Big Spirit and East Okoboji. And so the water was running through there like it does during high water times. But then the high water receded. And so they thought, well, we'll just try to get more water for the power of the flour mill. So they just dug out a channel between Spirit Lake and East Okoboji. Now I think, as many of you know, there's about an 8-foot elevation difference. And if that would have been allowed to proceed, Big Spirit Lake would have been shrunk by probably 1/2 or 1/4. So that little episode did not last very long. So the state monument in Arliss Park. Abbie Gardner, after she was married and after a fairly long interval of time, came back and bought her cabin in 1891. Her purpose was to preserve it. In her book, she describes that it was being undermined by water. If Abbie would not have done that, we wouldn't be here today. Either with the Abbie, we would, hopefully, but Abbie Gardner, that historic site probably wouldn't be there. So it kind of reminds me of the efforts now to preserve the cabin that started with Abbie in 1891. Now Abbie thought that there should be some monument other than a cairn of stones to identify where all of this history happened. She went down to Des Moines in the winter of 1894. And she was a one-person lobbying committee, and she stayed there the whole winter lobbying for this monument to be built. The legislators might have allocated money to buy it anyway, but I just in my mind's eye can see Abbie showing up day after day saying, we need this monument, let's do it, let's go for it, and then week after week, maybe month after month. And I have a feeling that at least some of the legislators went, okay, we'll build your monument, now please go home. But by the way, they allocated $5,000 to do that. That's $165,000 in today's money. And so those of you, probably a lot of you that have been in that location, that monument is still as true and big as it was when it was built in 1894. This is a site near Redfield, South Dakota, where Abbie Gardner was rescued. She was taken captive, of course, March 8th. She was finally rescued about 86 days later. I believe that says 83. I think if you look at it on the calendar, it probably was a couple days after that. There's some other very fascinating words that Abbie has about that experience. That'll be coming up in just a little while. So here is an interesting photo. It shows the cairn. The cairn represents those people that I just described, her mom, her dad, her sister, those little children are buried there. In the background, you see the cabin, and in the background of that, you see a little cottage. And after Abbie was there using the cabin as a museum and as a tourist attraction, she built that cabin so that she could allocate all the space in the log cabin for her museum. By the way, she would charge $0.25 to get in. And there's another little story here that'll be coming up fairly soon. Again, Abbie at the cabin, probably before she purchased it in 1891. Now, if you notice, the cabin is 2 stories tall. When they built it, it was maybe had a little loft in it, but it certainly did not look like this. What happened is a couple of years after the massacre, a family by the name of Pillsbury bought the cabin. They had quite a large family, and so they added the 2nd story on. So from about 1859 or 60 until 1974, that was the appearance of the cabin. In 1974, the State of Iowa Historical Commission thought, it should really look like it did in the 1856 when it was built, and 1857. This is kind of a significant photo. It is of a Indian, Native American minister, and there's maybe, to me, one of the most fascinating stories about Abbie Gardner relates to that, but there is another slide coming up, and at that point in time, I'll go over that story. When Albert was showing this program, at times it appeared as though there were pictures that may not be entirely related to the story, but pictures of Native Americans just to spice things up, I guess. A little melodramatic aspect here. Another so-called Native American. To me, it looks like a European/white person made up to look like a Native American. Early Spirit Lake, about 1929, and looking north, of course. A very, very early picture of the lakes area. Where are we? Where's that picture? Anybody have any thoughts? Smith's Bay, exactly. Yeah, Smith's Bay looking towards Purdy. And notice how basically vacant it is. I suppose now that the boardwalk would be in that area. Again, picture of Abbie and probably her son, Albert, and his wife. The little tent is what she put up almost immediately after she bought the cabin and before it was replaced by the actual wooden cabin. This is a picture of Iron Hawk. One of Abbie's rescuers. There will be a picture coming up that gets into this in more detail. And Iron Hawk and 2 other people were designated to try to find Abbie and rescue her. And the details of that will be coming up. On a Sunday afternoon, isn't this kind of iconic? People having a great time and crowded along the shores of West Okoboji. Now, in the brochure, it said that there would be a little musical interlude. That's what Albert, I guess, provided. And I volunteered to do that with Mary. I have a good yodeling song. But Mary turned me down. I can't figure out why. But in place of that is another song which will be introduced now.
Okay, what you're about to hear is something called the Okoboji Waltz, written in 1921 by a summer resident here from Des Moines by the name of Edward C. Horn. He was a writer, composer, piano teacher, and was very well thought of as a musical educator in the area for many years. So let me introduce to you the Okoboji Waltz. And not yet? Musical styles have changed significantly over the years. Back to Ed.
And one thing that Jonathan didn't say is undoubtedly this was played during Albert's slide presentation because Edward C. Horn was on the program that we've got here that actually occurred in the 1930s with Albert Sharp. So what you just heard would have been heard in the 1930s if you'd seen this slideshow then.
All right, thank you. The bridge between the lakes and, of course, the swing bridge on the other side with the Okoboji store in the foreground. When the legislature had allocated the money, they instituted a committee to plan the monument. Abbie Gardner in the center, of course, was one of them. In the upper right hand, C.C. Carpenter was a former governor. And there's J.F. Tacombe up there. And the other person I'm not familiar with, but I do have, and R.A. Smith. I do have a little story about R.A. and J.F. They were members of the rescue group that was sent from Fort Dodge. That Norris Markham had warned other people who then went to Fort Dodge, and they put together a militia of about 91 or 92 people. They started out from Fort Dodge on about the 23rd of March. Quite a bit of time had elapsed. And it was a terrible, terrible trip up. It was just that period of time where there was still a lot of snow, and yet some snow was melting. They had to ford streams. There was a story where 20 or 30 of the people in the militia would have to go forward and tramp the snow down so the oxen could pull the wagons ahead. They had a lot of difficulty. And I don't know if this is a funny story or not, but poor JF, who was a captain, one of those days, about 4 days after they started, he got totally exhausted. And so the story that I read said that in order to revive him, they gave him, quote unquote, a cordial. They shot of booze, I guess, basically. And I suppose that would have been okay, except the person that found the little vial, or whatever it was contained in, did not get a shot of booze. He instead got a shot of laudanum. Laudanum was basically opium. And For quite some time, JF was feeling no pain at all. Thankfully, he did recover and was able to proceed and appropriately be a part of the planning committee. This cairn stone represents, I think, the first location of the grave of Abbie's family. And I say that because if you visualize where the present one is, it appears as though this is much closer to the lake. But in any event, that's, of course, Abbie Gardner. Note that in a lot of the pictures that you see, she is dressed in black. Love this picture. This is, of course, looking toward what? Pillsbury Point, yep. And that is the steamship Huntress that I had not seen before personally. I believe it was launched on the lake about 1850 or 1897. Okay, now the next one. Isn't that great? That's my favorite picture, I think, in this whole program. I mean, Acton Zany at Arnold's Park, and nothing has changed. So if you take a look, somebody tried to figure out how many people. I keep seeing more people, but look up in the upper right, and there's a lady standing on the limb. Then to the left of her is a lady that is either sitting on an eagle's nest, or she has a mammoth hoop skirt on, and I don't know how she got out on the limb if that's the case. And then the guy, who must be about 6'2" or 6'3", I love how that projects, because the limbs are all slanting at a slant, and he's at a sort of a perfect slant to them. I haven't figured out what that is. It might be just, it looks maybe a dog, a panther. I don't know. The other thing that's a little zany about this, the Huntress was tied up close to shore. Either the rope was awful rigid or it was 20 below at the time. How do you do that? How do you get a rope go at right angles and then come right on down? But the essence of it is, again, people having fun, people goofing around, and that's, I think, a very wonderful scene. Again, people swimming, looking probably toward where Philworth's is today. At the driveway between, again, east and west Okoboji, quite narrow. Probably this slide or this picture was taken in the horse and buggy days. And the question came to my mind, looks like a single lane, right? And so if one horse and buggy was going north and another horse and buggy was going south, and they meet in a one-lane area, I don't know much about horse and buggies. Can you back up a horse and buggy? I guess, hopefully you can. Okay. This is one of the rescue Indians. I would try to pronounce the Indian version of his name, but what a wonderful translation it is. Beautiful voice. And so he was one of the Indians that rescued Abbie. Alrighty, this lady, for the note here, was Miss Louisa Church. A After the massacre at the lakes, Indians went up to and had a camp at Heron Lake up in Minnesota. And they, about 7 days later, proceeded to attack Springfield. When Morris Markham warned Springfield, they got together and got into one of the larger cabins to use it as a fortress, I guess. But then nothing happened. And then another day and nothing happened. And so, naturally, they thought, well, that was a false alarm. And they went back to their cabins. And about that point in time, the Indians attacked. Now, this picture was taken about 28 years after the incident. This girl, at the time, probably a teenager or early 20s, would load the guns that the men would use to shoot. Finally, she took up a gun and shot, and an Indian fell. They couldn't locate the body, so probably just wounded him. But yeah, you wouldn't want to mess around with her, and I do love her granny glasses. They're great. Okay. When the rescue Indians located the Abbie Gardner and the Indians that were holding her captive, they were about at Redfield, South Dakota, along the James River. And this represents the conference between the Indians that were holding her captive and the three friendly Indians. And if you notice in the left-hand side, there is a picture of Abbie in the white dress, probably didn't have that on, and then maybe an Indian wife next to her. Again, to get some idea of what Abbie went through, here's Abbie's own words. So she was sitting there, wondering if she would ever be free. And here's what she said happened. Some of the Indians would come up to her, and one would say that I would be taken to the river and drowned, portraying with gestures my gasping for breath and dying struggles in the water. Another would tell me that I would be bound to a stake and burned, showing the manner in which I would writhe and struggle in the flames. Another declared that I was to be cut to pieces by inches, taking his knife, beginning at my toes or my fingers. He would show how piece after piece would be cut out, and might bring from me the last possible groan and the last possible pang of anguish. But now on the other hand, later on, an Indian wife came up to her and took pains to tell me that there were no truth to these yarns, but that I was to be taken where there were many whites, and that I was to be free again. Which brings up the fact that in Abbie's books, the Indians are portrayed as brutal savages who wouldn't portray them that if they had suffered as Abbie did. On the other hand, Ink Paduta and his group had suffered at the hands of white people. The Indians in general had been pushed back and pushed back. Their hunting grounds were being taken over. And there were three specific incidents before the massacre, by which the white people were very, had very much painful relations with the Indians. But that's another program. All right. The Indian war camp. When Abbie was observing her whole family being killed, and she had not yet been attacked, and she didn't want to live anymore, and she went up to Inkpaduta, or one of the other attacking Indians, we're not sure, and she said, "What are you waiting for? Just get it over with." And far from an expert in Native American culture, but my understanding is that they valued people that came out in the open and said, "Here I am, deal with me," as opposed to cowering under a bush somewhere. And that may have been the start of it. At any rate, evidently the Indians that held Abbie captive communicated to them how brave and steadfast Abbie had been. And so after Abbie was released, and as she was heading back to civilization, the Indians that rescued her gave her this headdress, which is unheard of for them to give such a thing to a white person, and the times being what they were, to a white female. And she treasured that and had it for quite a few years. But it seemed like bad luck or bad karma or however you want to view it. Her house burned down, and with it, her treasured headdress. This is a scene of the Maddock cabin. That's the one that was near the isthmus. That was the first one that was attacked. Many people have seen this picture, and they have decided or assumed that all the cabins had been burned down, but the Maddock cabin was the only one. Now, they show here that the Indian encampment was very near the cabin. I'm not sure, I think that's artistic license, but it was somewhat near. And it was where they had their summer encampment for many years. So it may have been that when they saw that, after all the other indignities that they had been exposed to with white civilization, that may have been the last straw. No one will ever know, but they did attack that cabin. One of the captives was a young wife by the name of Lydia Noble. Abbie describes her as being quite strong-willed and not taking too greatly to being ordered around, which they were, day after day, ordered around. Abbie describes the role of females as the Indian wives being slaves of the men, and the captives being slaves of the slaves. Okay. Nope. No mind. It doesn't matter. I think you'll be able to hear me. Okay, here we go. What happened was this. Way into where they were being held captive, Abbie and this Lydia Noble was together. They were together in a teepee. I suppose the artist depicted that one with the open cover. McLeod, who was the son of Peduta, came up to her one evening, and we don't know, Abbie doesn't say, all she describes is that he ordered her out to do something, we don't know what. And Lydia had had enough of this. And she said, no, I'm not coming out. Don't say no. Maybe even the Indian wives wouldn't say no, let alone the captain. The roaring cloud took Lydia, drug her out, and beat her to death. Again, Abbie views this again and again and again. She's exposed to this kind of violence and horror, and simply beat her to death and left her lying there. She tells how Lydia was, her corpse, had the indignity of being a target practice for them. So, again, sad scene. All right. Next up is, this is Governor Medary of Minnesota. I've been curious and haven't been able to find out how Minnesota was so supportive of the captives who were all from Iowa. But Governor Medary lobbied the territorial legislature, or perhaps he just had the ability to get funds to fund a rescue group to try to find the captives. And they're pretty smart. They knew that if they would have sent the cavalry out there, that they probably would have killed the captives, and perhaps they wouldn't have been able to track them. But Governor Medary probably is one of the main reasons that Abbie survived. And the one other captive, Mrs. Marble, also was rescued, and Governor Medary was key in that happening. This is Mr. Flander, who was the Indian agent of that area at the time. And he was the one that organized and selected the Indians to be a part of the rescue expedition. So again, without Mr. Flander, the rescue may well not have taken place. As you're aware, probably Flandreau, South Dakota, named after Mr. Flandry, 15 or 20 miles north of Sioux Falls. This one makes me smile. Abbie, seated third from the left. Notice, in most every single picture, Abbie is wearing black. And in this picture, surrounded by friends, evidently, or visitors, she is wearing a nice multicolored dress. Where this exactly was taken, I'm not sure, but in the lakes area somewhere. And I think it's a beautiful picture. It shows a travoy, which of course was used by the Indians in the absence of wheeled vehicles to haul things. In the cabin museum, there is a picture which I thought was sort of interesting, of several dogs that were having, or towing, if you want to call it that, a travoy. So larger items behind horses, smaller behind the dogs. This shows approximately where some of the things happened. I'll use my handy dandy. You know, I've never used this before to do this. I usually use But anyway, of course, the area there is where the massacre occurred. Right about there is where Springfield was, that was attacked, now called Jackson. One of the next scenes here is the Big Sioux River, and right about there is where Redfield, South Dakota is now, and it is where Abbie was rescued. Okay. Pipestone. Pipestone, also called, I believe, Caplanite or metamorphic mudstone. That sort of makes me smile too. You know, geologists have all of these technical terms for rocks, but all I could think of for this one was mudstone. Maybe they ran out of the scientific depiction. There's about 4 feet of soil, and then the veins of the Caplanite or pipestone. Now, if I could get Holly to come up here, you're on. And I have an example of a piece of pipestone, and I would like to have Holly read what this says.
Quarried by Mrs. Abbie GARDNER Sharp, September 25th, 1892.
Perfect. Okay. Her experience at Pipestone I think is an epiphany, if you want to call that, for Abbie. This is the center of Native American sacred ground. And there was Abbie in 1892 there, and actually quarried this. My feeling is that meant she was down digging and chipping it out. And to have this memento of Abbie Gardner, something that she valued and something that she actually mined for, if you will, is, I think, pretty amazing. All right. I'd never seen this picture before. If you take a look at it, site of the lodge of the 4 captive white women, Mrs. Abbie GARDNER Sharp. I don't know, at the time it was just Abbie Gardner. And Mrs. Noble, who of course was killed. Mrs. Thatcher, a scene coming up about her. And Mrs. Marble, who was rescued about 3 weeks before Abbie. And so what happened was this: as the Indians were holding the captives, day after day after day, Abbie describes it as being just a horrible experience, wading through waist-deep, ice-cold water, having not a real good chance to rest, not being given much food. But when they got, by they I mean the Indians, when they got to Pipestone, they rested for 3 days. And so that may have been a period of time where Abbie and the other 3 could actually visit and get acquainted with each other. That was the last day that all 3 of them were alive. When they were at Pipestone, Abbie, in 1892, Abbie gave a speech or a presentation to a group of Native Americans who were attending a church service. She described to them some of the things that we've just been hearing. And as you can imagine, the Native Americans may have not been too comfortable listening to what their forebears may have done. But then Abbie says this, and I want to read it to you because I want to make sure it's correct. She ends up by telling them this: through the manifestation of Christ's Spirit, my former hatred toward the Indians has changed to friendship and highest regard. I pledge to you my sympathy and kindness. She forgave them. How could you do that? But it was a reconciliation, a rejection of a former strong-held belief. It takes quite a person to do that, especially in those circumstances. To me, that may be the most significant thing about the whole story. She forgave them. Next up. We talked about Elizabeth Thatcher. Elizabeth was 19 years old. She was abducted from the furthest north cabin, the one, I think, as I mentioned, that is near what is now Arthur Heights housing development. She was just 19. She had given birth only 3 weeks before the massacre, and then was abducted. Having given birth only 3 weeks prior, she was naturally a little bit weak. She had trouble keeping up. But by the time they got to the Big Sioux River after the encampment at Pipestone, her strength had returned. And so Abbie was encouraged by that. When they got to the Big Sioux River toward the end of March, it was high, of course, from the melting snow, and there was a log jam. Abbie calls it a log bridge. You can't see it too well, but it's up in that vicinity. And the captives were required to carry heavy packs. Abbie describes them as being 70 to 80 pounds, and quite a burden. And when Elizabeth got to the edge of the log jam or bridge, one of the Indian braves took her back. And they knew it was not out of consideration or courtesy. And poignantly, Elizabeth says to Abbie, Abbie, if I should not survive, and you do, please tell my family that I tried very hard to live for their sake. And she started across on the log bridge. And about halfway across, an Indian pushes her in high water, ice cold, strong current. But Elizabeth swam to one side got to the shore, she was pushed out, as is described here, with some sticks or whatever. She then swam to the other side with that urge to keep living. Same thing happened. She then went to the other side, think of that, ice cold water, and the same thing happened. And at that point, she was shot and left to drift downstream. And Abbie forgave them. Again, an amazing thing. These are, again, 3 members of the committee that designed the monument. Albert knew the value, I guess, of being a little melodramatic, and that's, I guess, depicts a fictional Indian attack. This lady was also in the Springfield, Minnesota settlement. She was shot in the shoulder, and when the attack was over, the survivors of the attack, we'll call them refugees, made their way south down the Des Moines River because they thought there might be additional Indian attacks. And Abbie describes the lady as being quite wounded, and bleeding, staggering, but yet had the fortitude to keep going. And again, a stereotypical Indian attack, not necessarily related to the Spirit Lake Massacre. This is Abbie being led away after the massacre with her family, a lot of it there lying dead. I have another story about how you can't make things up, can't make this up. Abbie had a sister. When I describe this at the cabin, when people come, Abbie had a sister, Eliza, who was 16. And then, after Abbie was rescued, she returned and was reunited with her surviving sister, Eliza. Well, how could that happen? Everybody in the cabin was killed. And Eliza was in the cabin until late summer or early fall. And Abbie's dad had met a person, a Dr. Strong, who lived up in the Springfield settlement. His wife was ill, and he asked if Eliza could come up and help take care of his wife. So, again, as fate or providence would have it, she was not in the cabin when the attack occurred, not in the Gardner cabin. But she was in one of the cabins when Springfield was attacked. But she did survive that. Now the plot thickens. The Gardners spent a year at Clear Lake and had a homestead there. While there, evidently, Eliza met a young man by the name of William Wilson. William Wilson actually visited them during the summer of 1856, and then went to Fort Dodge for the winter. Heard about the massacre, and evidently William and Eliza had fallen in love, and he was totally saddened and disturbed by the fact that perhaps Eliza had been killed. Then, plot thickens again, he was a part of the rescue group. So if you get the picture, Eliza was headed with the refugees south along the Des Moines River at the same time that William Wilson was with the rescue group heading north, and you can't make this up. They met at about where Estherville, Iowa is. There are some people, by the way, that are perhaps thinking about a movie. This has everything, doesn't it? It has romance, it has violence, it has adventure. But at any rate, here's the scene. You can visualize it, right? Here they go. Eliza sees William. William sees Eliza. And I don't mean to make light of it because I'm sure they were overjoyed, but you can picture the scene right in the movie. It's going to be slow motion. And they come together and they embrace. And it is a happy ending. And in fact, shortly after that, they did get married. You know, I hope that Albert Gardner had an audience half as good as you guys. You've been wonderful. Thanks for your attention. And there will be a question and answer session, but thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Ed. You did just a marvelous job of not only telling the stories, but also telling the facts. You were just perfect for this. Thank you. And also thank you to Abbie for her perseverance. And we are still hearing her stories today. As Ed said, he's happy to answer questions if you'd like to hang around to ask questions. And if you need to leave, that's fine also. If you did fill out your name and address little slips of paper, if you would hand them to the guys at the door there on your way out, that would be awesome. And thank you again for coming. And thank you to Anita Lombard for being here for the Friends of the Abbie Garden Cabin. Thank you.